It began in 1627, when a group of around 50 British settlers landed on the Caribbean island of Barbados. They planned to transform this uninhabited wilderness into farmland, and they brought along their own workforce. Many of the settlers who arrived on these beaches were what was called indentured servants. These were poor people who had in effect sold themselves and their labour, usually for a term of 5 years. What they got in return from their new masters was transport from Britain and basic provisions while they worked, which usually meant just food and shelter. What they were promised at the end of their term was 10 acres of land here in Barbados. Now, this system wasn't slavery, but the indentured servants were often very badly treated, and they certainly weren't free. These servants and labourers were contracted to a handful of masters, pioneers such as James Drax, and later Christopher Codrington and Henry Lascelles. They were ambitious men, hungry for wealth and power. In the first decades, the colony grew by farming tobacco, cotton, and indigo. Now, the more far-sighted among them began to invest their still modest fortunes in the skills and the technology needed to begin an experiment. They planned to cultivate a new crop, a form of giant grass, originally from New Guinea and brought to the Americas by the Portuguese. This agricultural experiment, led by James Drax, would be the catalyst for the use of slave labour on an industrial scale. African slaves weren't unknown in Barbados. In fact, when the very first British settlers had been on their way to the island, they'd captured a Portuguese ship and seized 10 Africans on board. Those 10 became the first black African slaves in the British Caribbean. What made sure that they were the first of many was sugar, and the back-breaking, labour-intensive task of producing it. The sugar planters tapped into the Atlantic slave trade that had been established by Dutch and Portuguese merchants. British merchants were soon perfecting the system, transporting slaves from Africa and returning slave-produced commodities back to Europe. Each year, ships were arriving, bringing in thousands of Africans. And although an African cost twice as much as an indentured labourer, the economics of slavery made perfect sense. An indentured labourer had to be freed after 5 years. A slave belonged to his master for the rest of his life. And what's more, any children the slaves produced automatically belonged to the master. Dating from the 1650s, St. Nicholas Abbey is one of the pioneering sites of the slave plantation system. For an enslaved African, this would have been a terrifying destination. Hundreds of slaves toiled across these fields in organised work gangs. This unrelenting regime emerged in part as a response to the nature of the crop itself. The moment you cut through a sugar cane, you started a stopwatch. The juice inside the cane will very quickly spoil. So the moment it's cut, it has to be rushed in carts to the next part of the process. Right. To maximise the cane yield, the slaves were forced to labour through the night. This was the first industry to adopt the 24-hour shift system. The process so far, working around the clock in shifts, 24 hours a day, was very modern. But what happened next was industrial. This is the factory. This is where the raw sugarcane was processed. And the power for the factory came from the windmill. Hundreds of windmills like this were built across the Caribbean, and they harnessed the winds that blow over these islands. The mill would extract every last ounce of sugar juice. Here too, the crop imposed a time pressure. If the juice wasn't quickly processed into granules, it would ferment and spoil. This system of industrial farming was so advanced that it endured into the 20th century, as this film shows. But during the slave era, it was a more brutal process. Africans arriving here had a life expectancy of 7 years. All of it, from the planting of the sugar out in the fields to the processing that takes place here in the factory, could only be done because of the labor of hundreds of men, women, and children. The British soon transplanted the slave plantation model to other Caribbean islands.